really happy and honored to be joined by four incredible speakers. First, we have Dr. Yu Jie, who is the Senior Research Fellow on China and the Asia-Pacific Program at Chatham House in London. We then also have Dr. Shruti Kapila, Associate Professor of Indian History and Global Thought at the University of Cambridge, and Fellow Tutor and Director of Studies in Corpus Christi College, also here. And then also Dr. Aleksandra Bērziņa-Čerenkova, which I hope I've pronounced close to slightly correct, who's the head of the Riga Stradins University China Studies Center, head of the Asia program at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs, and a member of the European think tank network on China. Finally, Cleo Pascal, non-resident senior fellow for the Indo-Pacific at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and senior fellow at the USANAS Foundation, fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and a number of other impressive affiliations that she has. So on Thursday, the 24th of February, Russia launched an all-out invasion of its neighbor Ukraine. And most of the world has been focused rightly, fairly narrowly, I think, on the implications of the crisis in that region, in the countries involved directly and in the region surrounding it. This has been particularly true in Europe, in North America, in the UK, and we haven't paid as much attention to what's going on in other parts of the world, notably the Indo-Pacific, even though the implications are significant, not just for that region, but for the world at large. So with that, I will turn it over to our first speaker, who is Dr. Yu Jie of Chatham House.
Thank you so much, Professor Hurst, for having invited me for this very timely event. And also, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Delighted to be here. Now, obviously, given what has happened, China seems to be attempted to play a pivot role in this entire crisis in Ukraine. But whether eventually that China will be able to step out and offering some kind of meaningful and formal and substantial mediation, and let's take a wait and see approach. Obviously, for me, there's three reasons that it's not really in China's interest to have this protracted conflicts between Russia and Ukraine. And firstly, for very basic economic reasons, that China has been the #1 trading partner with both Ukraine as well as with Russia. Now, with the Ukraine has been a major source of grain supply for the Chinese consumers, as well as a major military equipment supply to Beijing as well. So it is not really in China's interest that, especially in economic terms, that having this conflicts and lasting for more than 3 months or so. So that's for the obvious economic reasons. Now we come to the tricky bit on the political reasons that why China should step forward and offer more meaningful mediation in here. I think firstly, what China has intended to do in the last 2 weeks, and by offering all this mumbo jumbo from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson, I have still really haven't got a clue what exactly they try to express. And essentially, what they don't want to do is they do not want to compare the situation between Ukraine and Taiwan, because first and foremost, that Taiwan is not a full UN member state, whereas on the other hand, Ukraine is a full UN member state. And what Russia has done is really direct the threat of national security and national territorial integrity of another country, which is very much go against the UN Charter. And that is also very much go against the cardinal principle of the Chinese foreign policy, which is that territorial integrity of a particular country should be preserved. So I think what China is intended to do is trying to draw a clear distinction between Taiwan and Ukraine. And whether they will be able to successfully draw that distinction, and let's wait and see what exactly China try to perform in here in terms of mediation. So that's on the Taiwan issue. Now, secondly, there's also something to do with that China's international reputation. I mean, we can all agree that at the end of the day, even if no matter what President Xi proclaimed that this partnership has no limit, we have to consider the fact that China is the 21st superpower, whereas Russia is the 19th century great power. They see the world differently, and they see how the international politics should be organized very differently as well. I mean, for China's case, China would prefer to exercise its so-called economic statecraft by using its economic might to extend political influence both within Indo-Pacific region, but as well as in the wider world. Now, whereas on the other hand, Russia serves more as a purpose of being a disruptor for international politics, I mean, irrespective it's come from what Russia has done in Syria, in the Middle East, or what Russia is doing right now in Ukraine, is almost taking a very traditional, that sense of territorial conquest approach of running an international politics. So from that point, that China and Russia is actually distinctly different. But however, this is also down to China itself nowadays, whether Beijing would like to take this opportunity of mending its much fraught relationship, not just with the United States, but with Europe in the past year. Whereas on the one hand, that many, at least two of the major EU member states, of the leaders of two EU member states was hoping China would be able to perform a mediation role. Whereas on the other hand, there's still much debate within Beijing and what exactly they should do. They really shifting that Xi Jinping's own personal invested foreign policy that is very much centered around Russia, and which is largely departed from any of his predecessors, that the Chinese foreign policy is centered around the United States. So that debate, and we have not really very much received a firm conclusion within Beijing as such. Whereas on the other hand, it seems to be very strong voice among the Chinese Foreign Affairs community that would much prefer that sense of meaningful mediation will be able to offer at Beijing's end. And that would be really in Beijing's interest to do so, to take this opportunity to mending its relationship with Europe. So another calculation that China will have to do in here is almost like drawing a profit and losses balance sheet. At the end of the day, whether China's association or Beijing's association with Moscow come as the greater cost than the benefit that Russia would necessarily bring to this bilateral relationship. And perhaps it would be not, I mean, judging by the situation as developed at the stage. And then perhaps at the end of the day, and China realize this is not really an ideal scenario for China, and China may just have to drop Russia altogether completely. So that is within Beijing's mindset of calculation at this moment. But putting the bigger picture of the so-called greater power competition between China and the United States, that at least initially China would consider by having a protracted conflict, or by having a longer term of conflicts between the two, between Ukraine and Russia, would perhaps divert Americans' attention, divert Americans' manpower and resources, shifting away from Indo-Pacific into Europe. But it seems to, judging really by the decision makers from the United States, that is very unlikely. So what China is going to do with the Indo-Pacific region, and that is another big question, which require Beijing to be answered very quickly. So in one word, that Beijing cannot really sitting on the fence, cannot sitting on the diplomatic straddle for too long. Otherwise, the rest of the world, and particularly many of the Indo-Pacific economies that watch China very carefully, that China perhaps will really have a moral duty in this case of be able to offer some sense of mediation. And whether China want to take that moral obligation, and let's really wait and see. So I ended my opening remark in here, and much look forward to hear your questions and comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much for excellent remarks. Now I'll turn the floor over to Shruti Kapila.
Yeah, thank you. It sort of feeds directly after the excellent opening comments by LGU, because my comments are based coming out of India. Though I'm teaching Cambridge, I'm interested in the Indian story here. And of course, the world was taken aback that India did not join in the condemnation of Russia at the UNGA. And this is kind of, so in one sense, for Indian strategic observers, this is not a surprise. This is in keeping with India's longstanding, not just friendship with Russia, but Russia is, of course, India's biggest provider of arms. It has also, of course, gone down since 2002, when it was 80+% of India's arms and equipment and upgradation and the like came from Russia. But of course, since its kind of closer relationship with America, it has gone down just a little over 50%. So one thing is actually the arms story, which is front and center and has been discussed a lot. The second is that there is an actual popular appeal for the Russians in India. And this is a very popular prime minister. It's a very populist prime minister. So there is a kind of popular sentiment behind. So this is backed by public sentiment, going back to Russia's Soviet Union, then support of India in the Indo-Pak War of 1971, when Bangladesh was created, and when the Americans had threatened a major warfare in the Indian Ocean, and that goes back to the kind of Indo-Pacific story, which is actually at the moment gone off center. People are not really looking at it, but it is the big story for the Indians, for the Chinese, but of course also for the Americans. Much like China, India has always not, because of its own ongoing issue with Kashmir, but this is not really what is propelling. So it's not like the Taiwan story that bothers China, but the Kashmir story is part of that kind of withdrawal. But above all, it is about India's new formed foreign policy, which is about strategic autonomy. So India doesn't wish to be part of either one bloc, particularly the American bloc, despite its moving towards it in the last 15 years. But in a way, what benefits India, which is not it is a rising power rather than a kind of superpower of the way China is, that a multipolar world helps India. That it will not wish to see just a kind of old-style binary between America and the Soviet Union when India kind of came up with its foreign policy idea of non-alignment, which of course has been issued again today. Those words were kind of repeated again. But this is not the same non-alignment of the Cold War, but about a kind of the beneficial position that India will enjoy in a multipolar world in which China and the US, but also other intermediate powers. Finally, I think there is an ongoing issue, and I have two more points. One point is about the global governance and India's long-standing position that the global governance order does not represent the international order. So the UN is incredibly Anglo-American, European centered, and that, of course, India has been vetoed out of the Security Council primarily by China. But even then, this is a long-standing dispute. So therefore, India will unlikely to kind of just go along with the kind of international consensus, liberal international consensus, precisely because it doesn't see the UN as representative of the global order. And finally, I think the Indians are really waiting and watching on the last point that GU has made on whether there will be not just brokering, and there's a really excellent piece in the Financial Times out today by Gideon Rachman on how Xi Jinping might be kind of forced to do something. I mean, there's a kind of way in which there's a gamble on China's militaristic role as a global superpower. So I think it will take away the fig leaf. The Russian crisis takes away the fig leaf that China merely wants to be an economic informal empire or a superpower, but it will be pushed into militaristic conflicts like what happens to major powers in the past. And I think the story is the Indians are watching it precisely because for India, China is a military superpower. It is the reason that India now procures arms, because its greatest conflict comes with the Chinese, much as it did about 18 to 20 months ago. So in short, Indians, this is not a kind of plea to the old kind of non-aligned movement, but it's a very thought out strategy to not condemn the Russians. And the Americans are unlikely to so-called punish the Indians, precisely because India is a major ally against the Chinese in the Indo-Pacific world. So I'll leave it there.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much for another set of fantastic remarks and really interesting points, both about India, China, and also some of this larger global strategic infrastructure and games that are being played between great powers. So we definitely want to return to that in discussion later. And next we have Aleksandra Bērziņa-Čerenkova.
All right, I hope I've unmuted myself successfully. It's an honor and indeed a pleasure to follow such knowledgeable colleagues, and I will definitely be falling back on a lot of things that already were said in this room. But so my task here today is to talk on Russia's perception of these relationships that were already covered today. And I would have to approach it in broader terms as well as in light of recent events, which is, of course, Russia's attack on Ukraine. So first of all, let me introduce a concept that I used for this relationship, and that's the concept of perfect imbalance. This is how Russia's and China's relationship, in my opinion, works. So this is not some sort of a fantasy concept. In fact, it is a very applied concept from the game development industry of all places. It means when you have two unequal players online, for example, someone who's a rookie, who's a beginner, and then someone who's been playing for many, many hours, you want to keep both of them interested. You don't want the rookie to leave the game. So what you do is you create a situation where the rookie still had some sort of leverage, something unexpected. So in that case, sort of this, and why am I using this? Because oftentimes when we speak about Russia-China, this relationship, we talk about asymmetry, as though asymmetry means that Russia is always sort of this junior partner that doesn't have a lot of the say. But I think the concept of perfect imbalance actually shows that as long as you have some sort of leverage, and what is a better leverage than a shared border, right? And a lot of also the leverage is symbolic. As long as it's there, asymmetry is not the right concept. There's not the right framework to look at this relationship and to dismiss kind of Russia's role in this relationship. So it also allows, it doesn't, again, perfect imbalance doesn't mean that the partners love each other and are in this for the long run or share some very high goals, but in fact, they're just working for certain goals together. So they're teaming up. And of course, what is extremely important about this relationship is that it's unstable. It means that the side that feels disadvantaged, it will use various means, including other parties. And so there's always this anxiety long term. And I argue that, of course, even though Russia's relationship with India dates back decades, there's been, in the Soviet times, this relationship. And I mean, my own grandmother, I think, went to work at a plant in India and spent a few years there as a Russian from the Soviet Union. So indeed, even though there is this, of course, extremely strong link, but still what Russia's been doing with India lately is trying to offset this Chinese presence and has been using formats such as, the post-Primakov doctrine. I think Primakov was the first one who came up with this in the 1990s, late 1990s, when he was the prime minister. He basically saw this tripod of Eurasian relationship, Russia at the center, of course, because why would you assign yourself anything smaller than being at the center? So Russia at the center, then you have Beijing, you have New Delhi. So you have this, but it didn't work because neither India nor China saw it as a viable option. But now Russia's kind of trying to revive that to balance this relationship with China and Vietnam to a lesser role. That endeavor failed, by the way, when Vietnam rather tried to use Russia to kind of offset China's dominance. But still, it was an interesting case. And also another quick example on China and India and how Russia is trying to use and trying to call India's name when it comes to its relationship with China. The 2015 Russian security strategy was heavily centered on China. So it was about China being this global guarantor of security, as a pillar. Sorry, I got to shush the kids. Thanks. Sorry. This pillar, and so China was kind of playing the starring role in the 2015 strategy. But when you open the 2021 strategy, you see China and India being mentioned side by side, and both referred to as prospective regional contributors to regional stability. So that goes to show that there's been a shift a little bit in the Russian policy. Now let me talk. So what I'm trying to say with this is that the assumption that Russia and China are headed towards an alliance with a mutual defense clause is faulty, and I disagree with it. And I'm ready, but of course I'm ready to be challenged on this. And there's many other examples. I just trying to save the time today. Now let me turn to the current events. Now Ukraine, what is the Russian reading of the Chinese position? So when Russia is talking about the Chinese position, of course, the messaging is that China is basically informed and it's on our side. The fact that there's parallel media spaces that have been nurtured throughout decades makes it an easy task. You lie here, you lie there, you misinterpret that, you quote that, and you're done. But curiously, if we look at a wider Russian narrative of how they're trying to explain why they attacked Ukraine, there's two narratives, right? And they're a little bit conflicting. So the first one, of course, is the neo-Nazis were trying to denazify Ukraine or whatever that's worth, and that it's a typically Ukrainian problem. We know how to handle them. They're basically Russia, and we got to get there and, big brother out of them. The other conflicting narrative that they're also implying at the same time is that the situation in Ukraine is a global US hegemony problem. And so that would mean that it would make sense for the Russians to tell the Chinese, we're doing this for you as well. We're stopping NATO here. But I haven't come across narrative like that, in fact. So Russia is not drawing a parallel here. Maybe somehow Russia is pushing this idea of denazification. We see it's also a little bit taken root in the Chinese messaging as well. So maybe maybe the audience has other opinions. My guess would be maybe because this story of us fighting NATO here, and you should be thankful in Beijing, contradicts a picture of a limited operation. So Russia would then, admit that this is not what they're calling it is. So they don't want this message of fighting NATO, which they're not, of course. And actually, I just watched the press conference of a couple of Russian POWs in Ukraine, and NATO didn't seem to come up. When they were asked about NATO, it wasn't a story for them at all. So my next point is, what does Russia want from China then? Of course, Russia is waiting for China to take a stand in its favor, or at least make it look like that, or at least not contradict it. And narratives, don't always have to be true. So when we look from the outside, we think that China's ambiguity, or maybe people do tend to think that China's ambiguity is Russia-leaning, all the way after the Olympic statements of, recognizing Russia's fears over the security architecture in Europe. We would read it. And of course, even this message on biolabs, when that was said again in the Chinese media. But Kremlin wants more. Because there is a fear in Kremlin that China will kind of ping-pong its way back into a renegotiated US-China relations now, against the backdrop of Russian invasion in Ukraine. Now, my next question is Russia looking towards what Yudia called meaningful mediation? Yes and no. Obviously, Russia knows that Beijing shares its fears when it comes to some of these, to the US hegemony and, so to speak, these other things. But it does not want to reinforce the image of junior partner. And through this, by submitting, to Beijing as this conversation, as this, the chair of the table and sitting there, telling Russia to, come to their senses, they don't want that because that reinforces that image. And now, and interestingly, China is softening the blow in Russia as well. For example, the Xinhua website in Russian speak about the today's conversation between Yang Jiechi and Sullivan, and they say that this meeting has been negotiated since last year, and this time has been set in advance. So basically, as if to say, this has nothing to do with Ukraine. We're not going to be talking about that. This is a whole different thing. So just to conclude, I know that I've been talking a long time, sorry. I'm not sure, and we just still know if the FT report on the military aid request is true. There's been a lot of debate in the last 2 days. I'm sure you guys have been in conferences all days, just like I have been. It doesn't maybe quite fall into the pattern I am painting, but what you're going to do, things don't always match up. But I think UGA demonstrated the calculations in Beijing, and they do not spell buddies with Moscow. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Great. Thank you very, very much. Certainly a lot to explore further in terms of this other relationship between Russia and China that's sort of been lurking on this and its implications also for the other powers. Next, we have Cleo Pascal.
Thank you very much. This has been really interesting. I'm going to go straight for Taiwan. So if Jemima, if you feel like putting up the map, that would probably be helpful. I'm going to look quite a bit at the Pacific Islands because they're very small in terms of land geography. They're very large in terms of maritime geography, and that maritime geography is strategically very important, has been, we know this from World War II. But also the polities are small enough so that you can see the dynamics at play. So you can see what China has been doing in the region, for example. And in the context of Taiwan, it's an area where 4 of the 14 countries that still support Taiwan are, and 3 of those 4 are in the Micronesian region. That Micronesian region, which is kind of highlighted on this map, is the strategic front line between Asia and the Americas. You can see where Hawaii is. Those are the sites of many battles during World War II. Control over those islands is strategically highly important. Now, control can come in many forms, and the current form that seems to be definitely preferred by Beijing is political. So you've got a lot of political warfare going on in the region as opposed to kinetic, that kind of win without fighting strategy. But we're starting to see shifts. Now, the reason that this area is so important for China, you can't really see it on this map properly, but if you can imagine China even more to the west, China's military power, the tip of that spear is the PLA Navy. And in order for the PLA Navy, which the PLA Navy put more ships, new ships in the water in the last 4 years than Japan's entire Navy. And they're launching ships at a rate of 7-to-1 compared to the US. They have the largest Navy, and that's not counting the maritime militia of any country in the world. In order to deploy that Navy, they need to break the first island chain. You need to get past this chain of islands that goes from Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and on down. And then beyond that, you get this zone, which is called the second or third island chain. This is one of the reasons why Taiwan is a strategic imperative for China. If you can control Taiwan, you can project power from there. You can get your ships and your submarines and your Navy, full Navy, out further into the Indo-Pacific. And so what's been going on is not just the pressure that we've seen on Taiwan, and we have seen increasing pressure on Taiwan, including a lot of forays into the air defense identification zone of Taiwan, but you've also been seeing increasing Chinese influence in the Pacific Islands. And it accelerated after COVID when countries got locked down, but you still saw Chinese flights going in and out of some of these countries. In 2019, 2 countries that previously recognized Taiwan, Solomons and Kiribati, flipped to China. And there's been immediate strategic advantage taken by Beijing. In the case of Kiribati, which is the site of the Battle of Tarawan, the Battle of Macon during World War II, an old World War II American airstrip is now being discussed for redevelopment by a Chinese company, a very, very strategic location. And in the case of the Solomon Islands, there were existing fault lines in the Solomons, but Chinese businesses came in supported by a overtly corrupt, it's on the record, pro-PRC prime minister and coterie, and created even more fractures. There was one province that wanted to maintain relationships with Taiwan, and the premier of that province was, they tried to deny him medical care when he got sick. He ended up going to Taiwan for medical treatment, and then there was a whole political thing that rolled out of that rolled into the capital. There were demonstrations in the capital of the Solomon Islands that resulted in the destruction of the rioters burning down a lot of Chinatown. And what we're starting to hear now is that the rioters were actually pushed by the police, kind of blocked other areas, but the exit towards Chinatown was left open to create this instability, which then resulted in a situation where the Australians sent troops in, which gave a justification now for what's happening right now, which is Chinese police advisors have gone into the Solomons with riot gear to support not just that government, but also overtly, they're saying, to train the Chinese nationals in the Solomon Islands. So that's a destabilization that's occurred in a very short period. The reason I go into it in detail is because China actually benefits from instability and creating an authoritarian government that gets cut off from the West, because then that government becomes more reliant on China. And in that way, China, I would argue, benefits from Russia getting cut off from the West and having fewer options, except for turning to China. Looking at, and which is why the India role is so important, because actually, if Russia can, as we've just seen, sell a lot of its oil to India, it looks like that deal will probably go ahead. And that Vladivostok-Chennai route is an oil route fundamentally. Then that might give a buffer to pull Russia a little bit away from that China orbit. But we're seeing this kind of very smart playing of the political warfare thing by China in all the Pacific Islands. Tonga was hit by a very severe volcano and earthquake. The U.S. has the capacity to deploy very large humanitarian assistance response, but Australia sort of wanting to show its proof, especially in the context of the Quad, told the U.S. to step back, don't worry, we've got it covered. They sent the HMAS Adelaide, their biggest ship. The ship unfortunately broke down in port in Tonga. It was completely out of power for 4 days. Meanwhile, China sent a very effective amphib and sort of gained that competition as well. So across the region in a whole bunch of different ways, we're starting to see much more Chinese activity in the defense and security realm, building on their existing political warfare gains in the region. And I don't expect that to back down. And we saw, in terms of that Russia-China thing in the region, in the Solomons, there was pressure from the Chinese embassy on the Solomons government to back the Chinese position at the UNGA. They didn't. They ended up voting against Russia, but there was pressure on it to abstain. So again, looking at kind of these peripheries where it's a little bit easier to see through that fog, what we're detecting in the context of how this could affect the Indo-Pacific is a situation where we don't see a backing down of China from the Russia position, but a benefit to China from increasing isolation of Russia and an increasing attempt to create this kind of political warfare beachhead that will be very helpful in the case of a Taiwan taking of Taiwan. If Taiwan can't be taken through political warfare, and Taiwan is always one election away from switching to China, like every other country in the region, and political and something kinetic is necessary. I think the message out of Ukraine will be, first you cut off comms, which is much easier to do on an island than it is to do in a situation like Ukraine, and then you go in heavy and hard before the world has a chance to react. And by that point, you have secured your positions in the second and third island chain. So I think that from the perspective of a free and open Indo-Pacific, what's happened in Russia has not been beneficial, especially in this part of the Pacific. That's it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much for excellent remarks and for also reminding us of the Pacific part of the Indo-Pacific and for bringing in Taiwan more explicitly. All four presentations, I think, have been phenomenally good and given us a lot to think about. I just want to add a couple of things really quickly, sort of to sum up, and then we'll open up the floor for questions and commentary. One thing that strikes me as interesting that actually all four speakers mentioned, either directly or obliquely, is this competition in worldviews between a multipolar view of the way the international system ought to work versus a unipolar or bipolar mindset, right? So I think it is fair to say that in the United States and actually across much of what we could call, quote unquote, the Western Bloc, there's an assumption that unipolar hegemony of the US and its allies is desirable. Bipolar competition, which is what we saw in the Cold War, is at least predictable and can be engaged, and it's fairly stable and actually leads to a peaceful situation, and that multipolarity is inherently dangerous and unstable, right? That's something like the concert of Europe that existed from roughly 1815 to 1914 is unlikely to be attainable in the global system, that this sort of balance of power politics between a series of great powers isn't really going to work. And I think it is true, absolutely, that the consensus in China, as well as I take it in India, probably in Russia as well, is quite different. In fact, in those countries, there's an assumption not so much that multipolarity is desirable, but that it's inevitable, that no one country is going to be able to dominate the entire global system, and that it's highly unlikely that we're going to lapse back into a sort of Cold War 2.0 struggle between two great superpowers that across the entire globe. So whether it's about non-alignment or a new positioning or a new architecture, however we frame it rhetorically, I think there is this sort of consensus in a number of great powers that multipolarity is desirable, or at least is going to happen, and that hastening its arrival will not harm their security. In fact, it would enhance it. The assumption wrapped up with that as well is that not only is multipolarity inevitable, it's actually likely to be more stable and more peaceful than a unipolar hegemony or a bipolar competition. Right. So in a sense, what we're witnessing then with this invasion is a contest of these worldviews. I think from Russia's point of view, the invasion of Ukraine bolsters its claim to a kind of sphere of influence and great power status within, its own near abroad of the former Soviet Union, and more generally Central Asia and at least part of Eastern and Central Europe. And I think from the perspective of NATO, it's obviously very different. Obviously, from the perspective of Ukraine as well, it's quite different. And it's about resisting that and trying to assert, again, the hegemony of the existing security architecture. So, from China's point of view, then, it does have this very close relationship with Russia that is now being prioritized in terms of trade, in terms of defense, energy, cooperation, all kinds of different areas. But at the same time, there are advantages to supporting Russia, as have been highlighted, that it can pull the U.S. away from the Indo-Pacific back into Europe. It can make Russia even more isolated and dependent on China, which I hadn't actually thought of as an advantage, but I agree that that's something that is potentially a benefit to China's strategic position. It has other advantages in terms of weakening Europe, maybe fracturing NATO, isolating different partners within that alliance, which hasn't happened, but I think China may have been betting that could happen. And on the other hand, we can look at reasons why China really does not like this conflict. As Yujie was highlighting a lot of these, but I think, the fact that the pretext for invasion was recognition of separatist provinces as independent republics is very problematic from China's point of view. It has its own separatist province, as the PRC government sees it, Taiwan, which is not a place that they'd like another great power to recognize as an independent state, if that were to ever come about. So the precedent of supporting an invasion on that pretext is difficult. Also of note, I think, is that China has important security relationships with Ukraine. Not in addition to the trade relationships that have been highlighted earlier. In 1994, China issued a nuclear security guarantee to Ukraine and has never withdrawn or abrogated that. In 2013, China signed a treaty of friendship with Ukraine that obligated China to protect Ukraine's security against certain kinds of attack and promised that China would never threaten Ukraine in any direct way. So there are reasons why China's hands are bound, why it's bound its own hands in this and is not able so easily to support the Russian position. In terms of playing mediator or honest broker, I note also that the U.S. readout of the meeting in Rome today between the U.S. National Security Advisor and a member of the Chinese Politburo and sort of general foreign affairs architect does mention the fact that the meeting was set up well in advance since last November, etc. But it also does mention that raised at the meeting were grave concerns about the situation in Ukraine and China's relationship with Russia. In terms of China actually giving support to the Russian position, the only thing I've seen is a report that says that China is going to widen the trading band of the renminbi versus the ruble, which is potentially quite important as an economic lifeline to help Russia. I've also heard reports, again, I haven't read the details, of China trying to open up bank transfer mechanisms outside of SWIFT to a greater degree that may help Russia, although that's an existing agenda point for China as well. If we look at Taiwan, what's happened in Taiwan, I think, is that the Taiwan government is very, very frightened by this situation, deeply, deeply, deeply unnerved by what's going on in Ukraine, not least because of the parallels, but also because, as has been pointed out, Taiwan is not a UN member state. Right? Taiwan is not recognized by most countries, including just about all great powers, as an independent state, despite things like the Taiwan Relations Act from the United States. So if anything, Taiwan's position is substantially much weaker than Ukraine's position in the international arena, right? So should it ever be threatened in a similar way, it's much less likely that other great powers would come to its aid, or at least it could be much less likely. We don't know. There's no framework like NATO in the region that can mobilize a large number of countries very rapidly and decisively to support it. And so what I think Taiwan has been trying to do is to reach out frantically to its friends and partners around the world. And I think it's been reasonably successful in that effort. I think that the relationship, the military and defense relationships between, say, Taiwan and Japan, Taiwan and the United States, Taiwan and NATO, including certain member states, at least, of NATO and the European Union, notably in Eastern and Central Europe, and especially the Baltic states. There have been extensive development of new military ties, it seems, there, that Taiwan is trying to create a security architecture in response to this emergency, and it does seem to be, at least to a point, succeeding. So what does that mean for China's position? I think China is going to try to refrain from taking an overt side as much as possible, to sit on the fence, to not take not take too strong a position. It doesn't want to play a high risk game. If you look at what's happened in the sort of public discourse in China, my good friend Maria Repnikova has just published a piece in the Atlantic arguing about how it is that, in fact, the framing in the public discourse has been anti-Western, anti-NATO, anti-US, but not exactly pro-Russia and not exactly anti-Ukraine, right? So there's this sort of general feeling that, yes, this is an opportunity to sort of turn the world against unipolar hegemony and in support of multipolarity, but not necessarily a time to take sides too strongly in the conflict itself. And so in terms of China's position towards Taiwan, I do not think that this will increase the odds of the mainland taking decisive action in any way towards Taiwan. I think China is very worried about its position as a regional power, as an emerging member of this multipolar balance of power world. And I think that destabilizing the situation with Taiwan, or more broadly in its border area, would risk that in a substantial way, particularly given the way the world has responded to Russia. Right. So I think that there's less chance in the near term, maybe not in the longer term, but I think there's probably a fairly clear signal that's been received in Beijing that this is not a time for the mainland to destabilize the situation with regard to Taiwan or other countries in the near regions like South Korea or Japan, or even in the South China Sea. I would be surprised to see that. It wouldn't really seem to play to China's interest to do that. Instead, I think we'll see more meetings like the Rome meeting, more efforts at sort of helping support dialogue, and maybe some of these financial measures that would help increase China's leverage and also economic position more generally. So I'm going to leave it there, and then we can open up to the floor, if that's okay. I don't know if we have a queue of questions already. Okay, I'm seeing one hand raised from Naman Habtom Desta. I'm not able to unmute you, unfortunately. That would have to be the host, who is Jemima. Well, while we wait for the IT to be sorted out on that. Let me see if I am able to unmute him. Nope, can't do it. Okay, so while we wait for the IT to be sorted out so that the members of the audience can be unmuted to ask their questions, maybe we could just have a brief conversation amongst the panelists around some of these. Oh, now I see a written question appearing in the chat. Okay, and that says, will the fact that Western governments and Western businesses, e.g. Visa and MasterCard, are willing to weaponize financial instruments lead to a greater effort to de-dollarization and increase in currency swaps in Asia in order to insulate from unilaterally imposed sanctions, perhaps strengthen the alternative commercial services such as Alipay and RuPay on a cross-border basis? Anyone in particular want to take that question? Yeah, go ahead.
Let me give a step on this. I mean, I'm not a financial expert, but I mean, from what I'm follow that depends on when we're talking about internationalization of any currency. It doesn't depend on supply. It depends on the demand. And for the moment, I mean, for the case of renminbi, for example, I mean, the amount of exchange with the Russian ruble is only around 150 billion ruble, which is about the entire around, I think so, less than 10% compared with what China dealt with United States and Europe and with the Eurozone. So it's a very small amount. But at the end of the day, I would say, even if that increase the presence and the utility of renminbi, but does not necessarily mean that the Asian economy would really would looking for diversify or de-dollarization. Because at the end of the day, if you look at the figure in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, the holding of the US Treasury bond from China has not decreased, but actually increased. This is actually just to show you the enormous financial power, the so-called exorbitant privilege that US dollar would have. So, I mean, my natural betting would be that, yes, you may have a smaller size of bank, which is less exposed towards US businesses, that more in favor of between this without a dollar exchange, without dollar transaction. But I wouldn't necessarily see there would be increasing the opportunity of other Asian economies trying to diversify and using renminbi in itself.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is a critical question, and we're starting to see it happen in other economies as well. So the potential oil purchase of India by Russian oil would be rupee ruble denominated. And in fact, that was the technique, it seems like, used to buy the S-400 system in order to evade US sanctions as well. And we're seeing it even at a micro level in Canada, where the weaponization of financial mechanisms against the truckers put a chill into US investment in Canada as well. So this use of essentially social credit at a macro scale type access, use of that kind of, are you the right sort of person or the right sort of country to play in our sandbox, is pushing a lot of people out of the sandbox. And it is incredibly dangerous, especially combined with the push towards digital currency, because if economies start to shift even more towards digital currencies, that'll give even more control over individual behavior. So the combination at the state level and at the individual level of push outside of the dollar system and into other mechanisms which are monitored and controlled in different ways is very problematic. And it goes to just something that's sort of this issue of unipolar or multipolar. And I think what we're actually seeing is it's not, the core of these things isn't individual countries, but systems. So we're seeing very different systems developing. And in that context, for example, the election that just happened in South Korea changes South Korea from one system to another system. And, so the new government in South Korea reinforces what we might see with the Quad, for example. So it's in the context of the Indo-Pacific, the two systems are this kind of, actually, I'd say old-fashioned state-based authoritarian control versus a free and open Indo-Pacific. So South Korea joining the Quad doesn't mean South Korea is joining a bloc. They're joining an idea or a system, that a free and open system supported by rule of law instead of ruled by law is more beneficial for them.
I think those are great points. Does anyone else want to add anything on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, going back to the issue of India's location with Russia, both in terms of arms and indeed natural oil and the right, India already has a kind of quite a developed sense of working with countries which have had sanctions against them, notably Iran. So I don't think we're walking into uncharted territory here vis-a-vis India and Russia and the question of sanctions. So while there's a lot of celebration and power being attributed to global financial systems, as Cleo points out, there are already other systems in place. And this is why I think this story is really more important for the China-Russia situation rather than the US-India one, which is also part of the matrix. So, you know, it would the Indians are not going to suffer from any American censure precisely because it is also in American interest for a kind of multipolarity, certainly in the Asia-Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific region.
Just to reinforce that, sorry to jump in very quickly, but this is why India is such an important country.
Absolutely.
Because India can bridge those two systems.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what it's playing for. It's not simply about a contest of ideas, which it is, in the sense that India is not going to simply sign on to a liberal internationalism, which it sees as hypocritical for about 50 or 60 years. But that's not in the mix. No one is doing the whataboutery about the global war on terror, or, you know, it's actually very, very, the Indian thinking currently is very much about China and how to kind of manage China. And conversely, India has, you know, done as in the last 2 years. I mean, it is able, despite China being the kind of 60 billion plus, you know, balance of trade in China's favor, India is able to cut off, you know, Chinese apps and the like during war. So I think this is about multipolarity, and India also forging very carefully that role for itself, an intermediate role between in a kind of multipolar world. So it's not an either or at all that the Western press seems to be, you know, thinking about.
Yeah, and sorry, again, very quickly, just to reinforce it, the Operation Ganga exemplified, I think, what India could accomplish by having those complex relationships with different groupings, and brought out not only 20,000 Indians, but a lot of people from other countries. And that was noticed. Nobody else did that.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, we have one other question coming from the floor, and I just want to give a chance to Yujie to take this question because it's particularly, I think, for her, and also because I know her time is quite limited. She has another commitment in a few minutes. So the question says, given the situation in Ukraine and China's reluctance to move militarily as a result of the international response, what are the chances of the US, Japan, or other nations recognizing Taiwan as a sovereign nation at the UN? Would this pour fuel on Beijing's fire over Taiwan? And if so, what would be its likely response?
Short answer, long answer. Short answer, no. Chance is zero to have this. I mean, in the eyes of any Chinese policy planner, this will be a nuclear option that would really make the Chinese feel perhaps they will seek to change the fundamental of the US-China relations back to 1979 is, you know, to recognize one China policy. So I wouldn't necessarily consider that United States or Japan or various other alliances within the Pacific would take that nuclear option. But what we could have is we would have, or most likely scenario is we're going to have a very intense military standoff between Beijing and Taipei in, if not years, but just decades to come, in the next few decades or so. But not necessarily, I would say, recognize Taiwan as a full UN member. I mean, Taiwan got kicked out back to 1971, and to recognize it again, perhaps this is not really at Americans' best interest, and perhaps it's also not at China's or at any other regional players' best interest either. Because at the end of the day, China's nuclear power, United States is nuclear power, and Russia is nuclear power, holding the seat in the UN Security Council.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Now, after Yujie's comment, I feel more confident with my own assessment as well. I just wanted to just quickly say about the U.S. It's a status quo power. It's a power that wakes up in the morning and says, thank God nothing's changed. It's not a power that's going to jump at an opportunity to fuel, to create instability through Taiwan. In fact, even in the case of Ukraine, we see that what U.S. is preoccupied with is to not turn this into a wider situation. We saw that the situation with the planes, right? The Poles were saying, we need to gear to help our friends across the border and with the planes, and the U.S. would, So that is my view as to how extremely careful the U.S. is, even in the Ukraine case. There is no, in contrary to what Russia's been broadcasting, when we've seen, broadcasts say that the U.S. has basically promised the Ukrainians, if you hold out for one more week or whatever, insert time frame here, we're gonna invite you into NATO and you're gonna become which is not true, right? We know it, sadly, or realistically speaking, it's not true. So that would be my calculation, and I hope you did. I don't know, did this sound right to you? Because I'm looking into your.
I mean, it's not just that. It's also the scenario, the economic condition within Taiwan, the economic condition, that sense of economic interdependence between mainland China and Taipei seems to getting closer, if not necessarily fall apart. So what I think while we're talking about international politics, I mean, this does not only apply for Taiwan, but apply for any conditions for any country, including China, including the United States. Look into the domestic political agenda of that particular leader. I mean, if we come back to this China-Russia ties and China-Ukraine situation, what China wants to do. At the end of the day, Xi Jinping does not want to have a hyperinflation that pushed by this Russia-Ukraine war, and also added an already quite high cost of living within China, and also while having leadership transition, but in entering his third historical term. So this is not really doing China any favor by starting something quite unthinkable at this stage. So that's why I suggested, even for the nuclear option, I think we're talking about something quite remote, probably zero chance in here. And also within Taiwan, again, that sense of economic interdependence, and perhaps we have to persuade President Tsai think twice before doing anything quite dangerous in here.
I just would note, I don't think anyone in mainstream politics, at least in Taiwan, is pushing for this option right now either. Certainly not the president's office, certainly not political leadership that I've seen, right? So I don't think Taiwan is seeking to inflame the situation by moving immediately for some kind of de jure independence declaration or otherwise. I think this is more of a hypothetical of, if this were to happen, what would be the response? Yes, Cleo, go ahead.
Well, so former Secretary of State Pompeo said exactly that on a visit to Taiwan quite recently, right? So I think in the case of U.S. recognition, it is very much dependent on elections in the U.S. Pompeo is on the record as saying that he thinks the U.S. should recognize Taiwan, and he is one of the potential candidates for 2024 if Trump doesn't run. And he said it, and he wasn't contradicted. But what China did do, or allegedly did, was there was a blackout in Taipei at about the same time as the meeting, which gives you kind of a sense of some of the levers of control that China may have and be willing to use in Taiwan as opposed to Russia using in Ukraine. And in terms of the kind of the economic argument, there's definitely domestic considerations, but the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party has shown it's perfectly happy to take huge economic hits, as we saw with Jack Ma, if it seems to benefit the preservation or some goal of the party. And in terms of this kind of the nuclear option, it's very interesting language, because one of the lessons that many countries in the Indo-Pacific are taking out of the Ukraine situation is if Ukraine had held on to its nuclear weapons, maybe this wouldn't have happened. And so you see a situation where Japan and South Korea and potentially even Taiwan are now thinking of actual nuclear weapons in a way that they wouldn't have before. And in the context of Taiwan, it's not so much Ukraine that they're looking at, but it's Afghanistan that they're looking at in terms of how they have to reconfigure their defense. And the concern is that the US wouldn't come to their defense. And so you're seeing not only a rearming, sort of a much more active weapons purchase, systems, but also look at training civil defense so that you could have more armed, trained Taiwanese in case nobody can get to Taiwan to support it in case of an attack. So the calculations, as you said, within Taiwan are that actually this is a much higher risk now, and that the hawks in Beijing are putting a lot of pressure on Xi not to look so weak, especially in comparison to a Putin.
Yeah, no, I think that's those are all very good points, and I think it is important also that we note that what's been happening just now has in fact motivated Taiwan to take a much more strident defense position, much more robust attempt to defend itself, but also other states in the region have noticed. You know, I think the probability of Japan rearming, but not rearming as such, more reorienting its defense posture, I think has increased. Although I don't know if that will happen immediately, but I think, you know, there's been this sort of slow shift over about the last 20 years in Japan towards, you know, wanting to be respected, quote unquote, as a more normal country, rather than being boxed in on defense, to invest more robustly in its own defense, and then also being a major military strategic player in the region on its own right, which it's certainly capable of doing, but has withheld making a commitment to doing because of its constitutional obligations not to do so, as well as other currents in Japanese politics. But I do think the tide may be shifting. And I absolutely think, as you've just alluded to as well, that the South Korean election last week turned largely on this situation. There was a otherwise reasonably popular president who lost pretty badly to a party who had a very different position, particularly on the China question and on the question of North Korea. So, I mean, the previous president had a very strong agenda of conciliation towards North Korea and closer relations with China. The newly elected president seems to have pretty strongly differing views, particularly on North Korea, but also more broadly on China, as well as on South Korea's alliance with the United States and relations with other countries like Japan. Do we have any other questions from the audience? It doesn't look like it. So if not, I wanted to just kind of open up this idea about sort of strategic triangles, perfect imbalance, and multipolarity. Right, because we sort of all talked in some way about these ideas. And so I wonder, what do we see in terms of this? Are these ideas compatible? Can we be thinking about, say, a new triangle of Russia, India, and China, or an old one where we talk about Russia, China, and the United States, or a different one indeed where we've got China, Taiwan, and NATO, mainland China, Taiwan, and NATO in some relationship? Can we think even about triangles and multipolarity? And this perfect imbalance idea really strikes me as intriguing. I wonder if we could hear a bit more as to sort of how that would operate, maybe not just in the China-Russia relationship, but in great power politics more broadly.
Okay, let me say so. Let me start simply because this idea of strategic autonomy and multipolarity is a stated aim of India's foreign policy rather than simply something that just comes out of analysis here. And the question is really how successful India is going to be in getting that. Partly because the American government no longer is ideologically in sync with the government in India. So the Biden government, and it's really interesting that India doesn't have an American ambassador in situ and has not had one for some long time, because it took a long time for, as it were, a person to be nominated. But so it's all very interesting. So I don't think of it as an India, China, Russia triangle, but really a different kind of square of India, China, US, and Russia, but also involving other intermediate powers that we have not really talked about, Iran in particular, but also Israel, because Israel also is becoming a very important strategic partner for India, particularly on the defense side. And the Ukrainian crisis, or this kind of story right now, will kind of, as it will, accelerate India's kind of defense procurement, which has been in line for some time, for the last 15, 20 years, but it will see a closer tie of the Indo-Israeli relations as well. So I think there are many moving parts here, as well as the whole other series of things in play, particularly natural gas, and the Chinese kind of world with and it's a shame that our Chinese colleague has left, the China, Iran, Pakistan front, which will also impact India. So I think there are a lot of things being, so in that sense, this crisis, this thing is not simply about the NATO world, which is how the press seems to be seeing this, or this is not simply about the galvanizing and the reanimating of the West, which is what all the commentary has been about, but really it is about how the intermediate and rising powers are negotiating a very different terrain and are much more in control than they were in perhaps even during the Cold War. So I think, and that is why I think I don't think Xi Jinping's will be able to delay or kick in the long grass this question of his position on whether he wants to militarily or support the Russians or not, because the Russians have actually asked for it directly quite recently. So I think it's interesting. This is not simply about Ukraine. This is not simply about NATO. This is certainly not about simply the American status quo. And I think as months will move on, the Indo-Pacific story will grab the headlines again, because that is where the greatest power shifts are going to play out.
Great, thanks. Any other thoughts? Yes.
Yeah, so I'm going to go on a rant about Russia, United States, and NATO. So please just interrupt me when you find that you've had enough. But basically, what I want to start with is how you asked this really good question. I'm going to narrow it down to kind of, to what extent would Russia be comfortable working, sharing the skies with the United States in a sense in this multipolar or how many other polar world. And I mean, I think read all of us a recent interview with Kotkin in I don't remember which U.S. outlet was that, and there he spoke about how Russia is almost destined for this anti-Western role, and he draws this conclusion based in Russian history, and of course many colleagues have challenged him on this, and so do I. I do not believe this is ironclad, and I don't think it's a predestination, but it is a mix of factors that has led to this. And the situation, and the story that, I deal in stories as a discourse analyst. I don't always understand when it comes to money flows and stuff like that. But when you look at the stories, Putin's cynicism that he's been broadcasting, it has spread. It has paralyzed a society to the extent that they believe that, the government is lying, but so is every government in the world. There's no idealism. And there's no truth. There is no difference between the Russian ideology and the Americans. But so back to the question: is there a version of the U.S. that Russia would be comfortable with? After all, we had the 2000s, we had the 1990s, we had the lines at McDonald's when it first opened. But I would say currently not, because under these skies, Russia is not ready to share them with the U.S. because the sentiment is not solely against the U.S. It's against the countries that form the collective West, the NATO and beyond, and it's a fake construct because it is a convenient country. It's kind of a counter identity builder. It's been used as a counter identity builder for decades already. To respond to domestic grievances. It's kind of, the Paradise Lost story when we were grand and wonderful and everything was going our way. And that is why I think it is extremely faulty. But that is, again, because I sit in Riga, right? So it's personal for us. But my caveat, I feel like it's extremely faulty when we start to speak about shoulda, woulda, couldas. NATO shouldn't have enlarged. You shouldn't have pissed Russia off with that. The expansion, Cold War thinking. it is not about that. It is about Russia's domestic buildup with blaming the other for every problem they've had. So in my reading, I'm not an optimist here. I do not speak for other. I don't know about the other countries, and colleagues have made good points here. But when it comes to a situation with Russia that it is today, is completely callous to its own citizens, I just do not see it as one of the pillars of a multipolar system. But I've been watching too much war lately.
Great. Cleo, did you want to add something on this?
Yes, so I'll flip it from another perspective, which is who abstained at the UN Security Council vote. So it was China, India, and the UAE, and they all had different reasons, and Russia had a different reaction to each of them. I think that there was a disappointment that China abstained, and that that created a certain degree. I think there is an but I think that for all the reasons that I've already mentioned, I don't think that's actually going to have a long-term effect there. In terms of things like understanding countries via narrative, Asian countries tend to have a very long memory of allies and who is there for them. So we mentioned 1971, but all the way up through to Afghanistan, and the U.S. $80 billion, whatever it was, of U.S. weapons that were left behind in Afghanistan. With the Taliban, India knows where that's gonna end up, right? And that feeds into a kind of that sort of a narrative around that relationship that has been built up for a long time. And similarly, if you're in your 60s or 70s in India, which is the average age of decision makers and people, members of parliament and military, as you mentioned, you probably would have gone to some training in Russia or in the Soviet Union at some point. You would have developed those relationships. You would have had a nice time. You would have been treated with respect. It was all part of that kind of the Soviet engagement with the non-aligned group. And they did send the ship when the USS Enterprise came up into the Bay of Bengal, and they didn't give India a hard time about the nuclear tests. And, so all of this plays into the narratives around those relationships. And so I think Russia was pleasantly surprised when India abstained. So that's kind of that dynamic. The UAE abstaining is part of this whole, this is a European white person's war. We don't want to get dragged down this track again. This has nothing to do with us, and it's representative of the feeling of a lot of the Middle East. The UAE, I'm sure, consulted with regional allies, and that's why, for example, Saudi Arabia didn't take President Biden's call when he tried to call. So these are not minor areas of the world, right? And focusing just sort of on this, China or US or NATO and China leaves out Africa and India and the Middle East and all of these substantial other zones where these other narratives around what's going on are taking place very, very quickly. Things are moving very, very quickly. And there was an attempt on the record by President Biden of getting the Quad to make a statement about Ukraine, and it was rejected by India. They're like, we'll fight China. We're here to fight China, but we don't want to get dragged into what we are perceiving as a European war. We had 2 million Indians who died in World War II on your behalf for the last war. I'm just telling you what the narrative is within India. We don't want to do this again. So but India will work with the US on a free and open Indo-Pacific. It will work with the U.S. on rules-based international order, on rule of law, on that sort of stuff. Which is why I'm very cautious about getting into this dynamic where we're talking about countries as having these uniform blocks, because there are a lot of areas where countries in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia will come together under what we're calling here kind of U.S. Priorities, but are actually free and open, rules-based, democratic-based kind of principles, and we'll fight for them. And so that is just something that I'm very cautious about. Yeah, please. Yeah,
just to actually add that this is actually about contingencies now. It's not about the ideological division of the world as perhaps NATO sees it, or as it was during the Cold War. And this is precisely about these contingencies now kind of gathering force. And for India, as you yourself are pointing out, Cleo, that the greatest story is the rise of China's military power on its doorstep, and India's quite apart from the 71 story where the Russians, enabled India in the Indo-Pak War, the more recent memory is 20 months ago when India had to fight off the Chinese on their own, which they did. And so I think the worry in India has always been that, what will be, who will supply the arms quickly? Will there be another Indo-Chinese conflagration come next summer? And that's also fed into this decision. So I think, I think it's a very pleasant conversation here, because it's made a change from what we read in the newspapers, which is very, very NATO and ideologically centered. And as I said, as far as the ideological thing is concerned, it's not that India doesn't believe in a liberal international order. It's just that it sees the hypocrisy of global governance, which does not actually represent the correct world order at this point. And I think that's part of the story, ongoing story in the UN, with the UN for India, and that's long-standing one concerning its membership to the Security Council.
Yeah, and just to reinforce an aspect of that point, there was globally also, and India felt this on the forefront, a perceived hypocrisy around how COVID was handled, and specifically. So India developed vaccines, which it thought were as good, if not better, than the Chinese vaccines. The Chinese vaccines were approved and the Indian vaccines weren't. And there's also perception of politicization and things like the way the Lancet covered it, and Indian scientists were targeted for their assessments. This has nothing to do. This has to do with perception. This has to not to do with the content of it. So this idea of there being actually Chinese influenced in this context benefits in the international system that India isn't getting is also creating. It feeds in to the way that they're looking at Ukraine, along with everything.
Yeah, quite apart from the fact that Ukraine has systematically and consistently voted against India's stance on Kashmir in the UN. Though it's not simply a tit for tat, it's that is also in the mix, that the Ukraine,
and the nuclear tests.
And the nuclear tests above all.
Yeah, just to add a couple of very small points on this. I think, it is interesting when we talk about which states are nuclear powers and therefore need to be sort of accommodated, that there are nuclear powers that are not declared and recognized in the UN Security Council, notably India and Pakistan, as well as North Korea, right? That have nuclear weapons that have been tested publicly and have been seen by the rest of the world. So it may not be enough, in other words, to be a nuclear power to keep one's security. So this idea of sort of developing nuclear weapons for a place like South Korea or Taiwan may not be the panacea. And if Ukraine had held on to theirs, it's not obvious that they would be as safe as perhaps might be assumed. The other thing that I would just what was I about to say? I was about to say something else. I honestly lost my train of thought there for just a second. Oh, yes. It's actually also on weapons and procurement, that in some sense, Russia does have an advantage in this game by the fact that it has been such a critical source of defense procurement and technology for multiple countries in this system. So, I mean, China on some level does not wish to alienate Russia too much, in part because it has this gigantic border, which has been contentious. They've fought skirmishes in the past on that border many times. For about 15 years, China construed Russia along that border as its primary security threat. So it's not as though there isn't a potential security problem. But the other issue is China sees procurement of weapons and technology from Russia as absolutely critical and fundamental to its own attempt to upgrade its capabilities, especially when it comes to the Navy and the Air Force, right? So the development of aircraft carrier technology, submarine technology, a number of different aspects of aircraft and Air Force technology, a lot of that has depended on procuring equipment from Russia and also licensing of technology for developing those, at least as quickly as they have, and deploying them as quickly in the scale that they have. So I think from China's point of view, there is that. From India's point of view, I think it's already been remarked, that yes, it's not just training, it's also procurement is vital, right? A very significant percentage of India's defense procurement over many decades has come from Russia or the USSR before that. And so if that relationship were to be destabilized, things like replacement parts and new procurement could be jeopardized, which interestingly would actually hurt India's security stance vis-a-vis China.
That's exactly.
And then the last point is that even in Ukraine itself, the role of Russian military procurement and technology, I think, is still important, because if I'm not mistaken, the aircraft that Poland was proposing to provide to Ukraine were in fact MiGs, not US built or European built fighters. And the reason for that is because the rest of the Ukrainian Air Force used MiGs and other Russian planes and before that Soviet planes. And that's what they were trained to fly. That's what they could operate. That's what they could service. And so this influence, long-term influence of Russia's being an arms market or arms supplier really may be quite important. I think I'm going to take one more question out of the audience chat, and then we can probably need to wrap up. This is, why has this scenario not put into question the ethical basis of nuclear weapons? The Non-Proliferation Treaty has not been unfolded in any serious way. Any
Well,
thoughts on that?
because I can tell you this. I mean, I'm not a fan of nuclear weapons here, and also, just to be very clear, not a fan of countries invading other countries. I'm explaining some of the perceptions around what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, but that doesn't mean that don't invade other countries. And I think it's bad, but it's bad is not the dominant factor in a lot of the decision making going on in some parts of the world, especially in this time of crisis. This is, and in fact, I would argue that India, when India did its nuclear tests in the late 90s, countries like Canada or the Ukraine said this is bad and you shouldn't do this and stuff. But it jumped India's position globally to a very large degree. So, if you're India and your perceived goal is being in a position where you can grow your economy, because fundamentally that's the goal of the leadership, is to create a situation where your 10 million university graduates every year have jobs and can contribute to the society. And your perception is you're in an environment where your security threats undermine that. And creating having nuclear capability increases your security. This is the logic. Then you're in a better position to deliver the other human security aspects that your population needs. I'm not saying good or bad. I'm saying that is a consistent logical track. So you can feel like you're a good person, you're a good strategist by developing these incredibly indiscriminate destructive weapons.
But interestingly, the way it worked, you're quite right that it raised India's status, of course, but I think the interesting story is how in the early 2000s, after India's declared a nuclear power, the treaty, the NPT treaty with the America, also brought India closer to the American orbit. So it wasn't, as it were, so it didn't lead to censure or actually distance, but rather that it actually raised India's strategic capital with the Americans. It's kind of long, and I think that's the kind of so-called contradictory or even paradoxical thing we are also seeing today with the Ukraine stance, India's Ukraine stance, that the Americans will not be able to take the Indians for granted in the Quad relationship or in the Indo-Pacific relationship. At the same time, as India has proven in the last couple of years, as I was saying earlier, that despite its dependence on on China's economic thing, it's beginning to diversify, it's beginning to downgrade that financial relationship and cutting off apps and the like. So it's a fast moving situation, as you clearly rightly point out, and especially if you take away the vision away from which rightly so, people are kind of more interested in the European story. But if you broaden it out of Europe, then it's a very different world that you're looking at, precisely out of this conflict.
Yeah, and just a quick data point on that in terms of weaponry is that during Galwan, Russia was delivering 2 to 3 plane loads of weapons a day to the Indians. So knowing what that would, how that may or may not affect their Chinese relationship, and we have a very Western view of how countries interact. You know,
and I think this is the point that, you know, that the Indians know deep down, like with Galwan 2 summers ago, that when China attacks India or aggresses or has skirmishes, it is left to its own devices. And so it also finds it, apart from Russia and the procurement, that it can't really build up these it can't walk into other people's wars precisely because of its own difficult border, not just with Pakistan, but increasingly with China.
And any other thoughts from Una on this, or just sort of concluding thoughts in general before we wrap up?
Oh, this has been fascinating. I've been listening with my mouth open. I forgot I was on the panel because this was really a lesson in geopolitics, as it says in the name. And thank you for excellent insights.
Great, thanks. Any other final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, thank you.
Great, thank you all. All 3 panelists still remaining, as well as Yujie, who had to leave us a bit earlier, and everyone in the audience for phenomenally good discussion. Excellent points all around. Excellent questions from the audience. I hope it's been useful. We hope to do this again at some point as the situation evolves, and we'll certainly be in touch about putting that together. So thank you very much, and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening.